All right. Well, thank you, Bernadette, very much for this opportunity to interview you. And I really appreciate, I know I was kind of pestering you a bit about this interview, but I really appreciate you making the time today. And I
Good,
want
Tom. Well, I admire persistence.
thank you. I wondered just before we begin if you wouldn't mind giving a small sort of self-introduction about yourself.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. So my name's Bernadette Tobin, and I'm the director of the Plunkett Centre for Ethics. And the Plunkett Centre is a joint centre of Australian Catholic University and a number of hospitals, St Vincent's Health Network in Sydney, and Calvary Healthcare. And then we're connected with a number of other Catholic hospitals and systems too. And what we do is we do research and try and publish in the best journals. We run a consultation service for people working in healthcare. And we try to make a contribution to the public discussion of significant ethical, social, political issues.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. So to start with, in your view, or what we'll be discussing today is euthanasia. So what is euthanasia, and what is not euthanasia in your view?
Tom, I think that's a very good place to begin because it's a word that is promoted for service in the rhetoric of persuasion. It has got no generally accepted meaning. It's got no philosophically warranted meaning. The Dutch use it in one way, the Nazis used it in another way, and it's used in a variety of ways with my students and people I work with. So I think if I'm going to talk about euthanasia, I need to clarify what I will mean by it in this discussion. And the way that I'll do that is by saying that, well, first of all, remember it's made of two Greek words, eu and thanatos, roughly a good death. But people who die in their sleep die a good death. And a lot of people die in their sleep. And we certainly don't mean that by euthanasia. So the central case of euthanasia is the adopting and carrying out of a proposal that, as part of the medical care being given to someone, his or her life is to be terminated on the ground that it would be better for him or for her if that were done. Now, this explanation encompasses both deliberate omissions in order to terminate life. They're sometimes called passive euthanasia, and it encompasses deliberate interventions for the same purpose, to terminate human life, and they are often called active euthanasia. Now, on this explanation of euthanasia, it can be voluntary, non-voluntary, or involuntary. It's voluntary when the killing is at the request of the person killed. It's non-voluntary when the person killed is not capable of either making or refusing to make such a request. And it's involuntary where the person killed is capable of making such a request but hasn't done so. I use the word killing. It's very direct, but I think it's helpful to clarify what we're talking about. Now, this explanation of euthanasia that I've just given distinguishes in a straightforward way choosing to kill someone with drugs to relieve that person of pain and suffering, and on the other, choosing to relieve someone of pain and suffering by giving drugs in a dosage determined by the drug's capacity for the relief of pain and suffering, foreseeing that the drugs in that dosage will cause death. The former is euthanasia, the latter isn't.
So, so then, why are some people against active euthanasia or passive euthanasia or other forms?
Euthanasia.
Euthanasia, just in general. Okay, sorry.
Euthanasia.
Okay.
Why are some people why are some people against euthanasia? That is, deliberately setting out to terminate a person's life by an omission or by an intervention.
Right.
Why are some people against that?
Yeah.
Well, I am. I think it's bad medicine. I think it's bad social ethics, and I think it's bad public policy. So let me explain, Tom, if I may, why I think it's bad medicine. Medicine actually can relieve all kinds of physical suffering. No one need fear that they will die in unrelieved pain, tethered to machines, etc. Now, there is no doubt that this happens, but it need not happen. We could ensure that it doesn't happen. We haven't bothered to do so. One of my colleagues, Margot Somerville, has argued that allowing a patient to continue in unrelieved pain should be a criminal offence. Now, that's a very strong way of putting the point that doctors can and should relieve pain and any other form of physical suffering. So that's one thing. And doctors work with other people, social workers, pastoral care workers, who can be called upon to help to respond to those other forms of suffering that are more psychological. Loneliness, disgust at oneself, the fear of being a burden on others, alienation, etc. So I think it's bad medicine. I think use of euthanasia is bad social ethics because it violates human equality in its most fundamental sense. That is, the value we have simply because we are human beings. We can say more about that if you like, but it's bad social ethics because it violates that respect for human equality, and it's bad public policy because once you legalise it, you cannot constrain it. Generally speaking, the tactic of advocates is to have it legalised in a very narrow and specific way, and to try to ensure there's no debate at that time about widening the scope of people who would be entitled to it. But once it's legalised, then it gradually opens up. So that's why some people, myself included, think that legalising euthanasia in the sense in which I've explained it is not a good thing.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. So, yeah, all right. I think that's good. So there's 3 points: the bad medicine, bad social ethics, and bad public policy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are these arguments relying on a religious claim or religious belief at all, do you think?
Let me reframe your question.
Sure, yeah.
Let me reframe your question. Are these arguments available to people who are non-religious?
Yeah.
Do you need to be religious? I'm a Catholic. I'm a cradle Catholic. I'm not
Right.
a very good one, but I am a Catholic.
Right.
But are these arguments available to people who are non-religious? Well, you'll remember that in philosophy, the relationship between morality and religion is a subject of continuing interest ever since that beautiful little Platonic dialogue called the Euthyphro raised the question. And you remember, Tom, Euthyphro, Socrates bumps into Euthyphro, and Euthyphro's rushing off in a very officious manner because he's good. And Socrates says to him, "Where are you going, Euthyphro?" And he says, "I'm going to report my father to the authorities." And Socrates says to him, "You're what? You're going to, you're going to dob in your father." And Euthyphro says, "Well, he's done a dreadful thing." And the dreadful thing was something like Euthyphro left his father to look after his slaves and other workers in the fields. One of the slaves got drunk. The father got so angry with him that he tied him up and he left him in a ditch and went off to decide what he was going to do about him. When he came back, the slave had died. And Euthyphro said this was a dreadful thing for his father to have done. He had polluted the whole household, so he was going to report his father to the gods. And Socrates says, "You sure you're doing the right thing?" "Oh, yes," he said. The gods think this is a good thing to report even your father if you think he's done a bad thing. And Socrates said to Euthyphro, "Is an act good because the gods favour it, because they like it, because they approve of it, because they love it? Or is an act loved by the gods, approved by the gods, because it's good?" And we might ask the same question: is an act bad because it's hated by the gods? Or is a bad act hated by the gods because it's bad? Now, someone might say, well, that was, way back with the ancient Greeks. We don't have their notion of God, but we can ask exactly the same question today about the relationship between moral judgment and what religions teach. Now, Euthyphro is a very self-confident man and he's not interested in this debate, and so he just he rushes off feeling very confident that he's doing the right thing. But what Socrates showed was that there are two ways in which you can think of the relationship between moral beliefs and the teachings of a religion. On one view, the moral content of a religion is not necessarily understandable by ordinary human beings. Morality all depends on God's will. Whatever God approves of is good. Whatever he disapproves of is bad. It's merely his will that makes something good and something bad. And if God were to change his mind, wake up tomorrow morning and change his mind, well, the morality of an act would change too. The moral status could change from it being good to now it being bad if he's changed his mind. Now, that's called the divine command theory of morality. But the other view is that the moral content of a religion is entirely accessible to ordinary human reason. It is not merely God's will that makes some acts wrong and others right. Ordinary human beings can understand morality. Ordinary human beings can distinguish moral truths from moral falsehoods. Ordinary human beings can defend their own moral judgments. And that view of morality is called a rationalist or a natural law view of morality. On this view, God does will that human beings shouldn't be cruel, shouldn't be dishonest, shouldn't murder or lie or steal, but it's not merely his will that makes such actions wrong. And the arguments that I have put to you about why I think euthanasia is not a good thing, I've put to you in this rationalist way. Ordinary human beings can understand the argument that I've put, though of course they may not agree with it.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that explanation. And yeah, indeed, the Euthyphro dilemma or story is a great one. And
It's a nice story. Yeah. Did that
yeah,
make sense?
oh yeah, I think so. So yeah, basically, I think you're saying, yeah, that the arguments against euthanasia, that is that it's bad medicine, that we can always relieve pain, and that it's bad social ethics in the fact that it violates our respect for human equality,
Yes.
and thirdly that it's bad public policy because once we legalize it for one group, it could expand, or it could be uncontrolled in some sense. These three arguments don't rely on religion in some sense, or don't rely, like they could be arrived at through reason and through not necessarily communicating with a god about morality, but just by thinking about it.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right. That any thoughtful human being of a religious bent or a non-religious bent, even of an anti-religious bent,
right,
can think about these things himself or herself.
yeah, yeah. That's really good. So then I guess, possibly from my own experience, I would say that most people who are, say, for euthanasia are maybe anti-religious, but and they might say, and they might, I don't know what they would think about those particular points that you've raised, but um, what alternatives would you say are on offer for euthanasia in adults, for that might convince those people?
Well, I don't know about convincing
Okay,
people,
sure,
but let me give a view of medicine,
mm,
which I think is a better view of medicine than one that legalizes doctors intentionally bring about the death of their patients. And it's this. And this view of medicine is what I'm going to call a Hippocratic Jewish Christian. It's a line of thinking about medicine which is absolutely traditional, absolutely standard, but is today controversial. And this is a view of medicine which says that medicine's goal is to heal, and one heals by, well, first of all, helping people to maintain their health. And that's what a general practitioner is doing a lot of his or her time, helping people to be educated about taking responsibility for their own health. So sometimes that's what being dedicated to healing involves. Sometimes it involves curing illnesses. Sometimes it involves stabilizing a person. Maybe you can't cure that person, but you can stabilize them in a condition which, all things considered in their particular circumstances, is satisfactory. Sometimes it involves relieving symptoms. And sometimes it involves helping a person to die in comfort and with dignity. So it follows that the goal of medicine is not simply maintaining biological life in all circumstances. It is healing the person in whatever way is appropriate, including as the person dies, helping them to die in comfort and with dignity. And that will mean that there will be occasions when it will be proper to withhold or withdraw a treatment that is sustaining the person in life. And sometimes it will be appropriate to withhold or withdraw a treatment that's maintaining biological life, but which is no longer therapeutic. It's no longer healing the person, or the benefits it offers are outweighed by the burdens the treatment imposes, primarily on the patient. Burdens in terms of pain and breathlessness and isolation from one's family and in some countries, cost. So if a treatment is therapeutically ineffective or overly burdensome, it may legitimately be withdrawn or withheld or withdrawn. And this healing conception of medicine also encompasses relieving symptoms. Even if the relief of symptoms hastens death. Now, sometimes people think that pain relief can have that side effect. Mostly it doesn't. Mostly when people's pain is effectively relieved, they get a new lease on life. But there are other terribly distressing symptoms like the breathlessness that comes with, say, a respiratory cancer. And the person may be struggling to breathe, kind of choking to death. Now, a good doctor wouldn't stand by and just let that happen. What he or she may well do is offer to the person, if the person's able for the conversation, or to the family, to slightly sedate the person so that they no longer experience that terrible breathlessness. Now, a good doctor will know that that will hasten death, most likely, because when you sedate a person, you make them more prone to infection, etc. But that's good medicine, and it ought to happen wherever, it ought to be on offer wherever someone is struggling with such a symptom. So if we're talking about alternatives to euthanasia, understood in the way that I have explained it, there is plenty for good medicine to do. It's never the case that doctors have run out of things that they can do. There's no more that we can do. That's never the case. And that's a form of abandoning patients. And of course, as you know, Tom, the other side of things is that it's not just physical symptoms and pain that people can experience. They can experience a whole lot of psychological forms of suffering. And for some doctors, that's their great challenge, to see what they can do to relieve those forms of suffering. But in the end, medicine has to be modest about its role. Its purpose is not to relieve the human condition of the human condition.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks very much for that. And if it's okay for me to recapitulate just slightly. So I understand that your sort of framework of healing for doctors and medicine is that in the end of someone's life, they would potentially be suffering a great deal, and doctor's role, medicine's role, is to heal that suffering as much as possible. And it may well have the side effect of hastening death, but that's not the primary intention or consideration or goal. That the primary consideration or goal is to relieve the suffering, and that's what it should be. Is that right?
Well, I think the language of primary intention just confuses things.
Okay, sure.
So as the person is dying, the role of the doctor is to do what she can to ensure the patient dies in comfort and with dignity. That's what I mean by healing the person as the person dies.
Right.
And on occasion, that may mean that the person will die sooner than he would have if he'd been left unhealed.
Right. Yeah. And yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it seems like it's mostly about the effective relief of their suffering or symptoms. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And yeah,
Yes.
there's no consideration about. Do you think there is a consideration to be had about hastening death, or do you think it should just be focused? The doctor should be focused just on suffering and needn't worry about whether it hastens death or not.
Oh, no.
Okay.
I think that would be negligent.
Okay.
Because the role of the doctor is to heal the person.
Right.
And that goal doesn't change even as the person is dying. But when death is approaching, that will be the context in which that healing ought to take place.
Yeah.
So the same considerations about treating human life as a value in itself, that they obtain throughout life. But as death approaches, death ought to be accepted.
Yeah.
So really, the critical thing in my opposition to euthanasia is deliberately trying to bring about death.
Right.
That's, in a sense, all that's ruled out, whether it's sought by the patient or sought by the family or the doctor thinks it to be a rather good idea. That's all that's ruled out. And then everything else is in the discussion and will depend on the circumstances of the patient and what means are available to heal that person as she dies.
Yeah, okay. And I wouldn't ask you to enter the minds of your opponents, but I wonder for you if you would guess that for some people that argue for euthanasia, that actually you and them might agree in some cases, or a lot of cases maybe, about, oh, that's like, I think it might come back to what we had at the beginning, which is the definition of euthanasia. But maybe some people who are for euthanasia are really not for deliberate
I
killing.
think that's right.
Yeah.
I think, Tom, that's right. And that's why I think it was good that we began with a very clear explanation of what we're talking about. But no doubt, some people greatly favour the legalisation of doctors deliberately bringing about the death of their patients, or deliberately helping the patients to take their own lives, assisting them to commit suicide. So no doubt that's the case. But I think it is helpful for you to have identified that possible confusion.
Yeah. Right. Thanks. So the next question that I wanted to ask, so we've asked about what are the alternatives for euthanasia in adults. As you know, the main topic of the video, well, maybe like the second half of the video, as it turns out, will be about euthanasia in infants. So maybe in your conception or in your knowledge, what are some of the differences maybe that you can distinguish, and what alternatives are available for euthanasia to euthanasia in infants?
Well, first of all, Tom, I think the role of medicine with all patients and at all stages of life is the role of healing the person. And so the goals in terms of the educative role might be with respect to the parents, not the infant, but curing illnesses, stabilising a reasonably satisfactory condition, relieving symptoms, and if the infant is dying, helping the infant to die in comfort and with dignity. So all of those obtain, and that means that according to this way of thinking about the role of medicine, a therapeutically ineffective treatment may be withheld or withdrawn, and so too an overly burdensome one, and symptoms ought to be relieved. Now, it is more complicated in the case of infants because, well, let me start this way. If we're talking about an adult, the person responsible for those decisions is primarily the patient himself. And it's a matter for the adult patient to say, I accept what's offered or I reject what's offered. In the case of the infant, That can't happen. And so we rely on the judgment of the parents, who are assumed rightly to value that little life, to recognize the value of that little life, to recognize the value. And we have to rely on them. Now, so what you need in that circumstance is a good collaboration between a good doctor and parents, because it's a terrible time for parents and a terrible suffering for parents. And in some circumstances, the decisions to be made involve questions of judgment. So you would know that the age at which an infant, preterm infant, that infant's life is viable, keeps going down. But the more it goes down, from 26 weeks to 25 weeks to 24 weeks, the decisions about what treatments will need to be provided in order to give the infant the best chance become possibly involve imposing real burdens on that infant. And so a judgment has to be made about whether the life-sustaining benefits will compensate the child for the burdens we're going to impose on the child. We can't ask the child.
Yeah, that's a problem, isn't it? Not being able to ask the child. So I guess, yeah, advocates for infant euthanasia would say, you know, you can ask the parents, but nevertheless, you would say, I guess, that asking the parents to participate in any deliberate decision to end life quicker than a natural death would be, you know, against, you know, it would have the same problems as we discussed earlier, basically.
Well, I think that we shouldn't legalise euthanasia. That is, we shouldn't ever deliberately set out to bring about the person's death.
Right.
Even if this is a little infant. So I'm assuming that's out of the question.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about is parents who have to make decisions about gravely disabled little ones, newborn babies, very premature little babies, where the decisions are about what treatment options are available, the therapeutic effectiveness of the treatment options, and the burdens that they will impose on the little infant, and a judgment about whether, all things considered, it's reasonable and humane to impose those burdens on the child. Of course, the starting point ought to be to preserve life, but not at all costs.
Right.
And that no one's infallible in these judgments. That's why parents need to be able to trust the advice and the judgment and the experience and the helpfulness of good doctors.
So I spoke to someone that's for infant euthanasia, as I told you, and something that became apparent, I think, in my conversation with them was that even in places where infant euthanasia is illegal, which is basically everywhere.
Well, hang on, not quite everywhere.
Not quite everywhere. Not in Holland, but basically everywhere but Holland, and I think maybe Belgium. Even though it's basically illegal everywhere else, they seemed to argue that it's still, in a sense, practiced, but maybe their definition is maybe not deliberate killing, but rather, as you say, kind of healing and weighing these burdens with the benefits, or with the considering the them?
My guess would be that that sometimes people would confuse a reasonable and responsible decision to withhold or withdraw a life-sustaining treatment because the burdens outweigh the benefits. They confuse that with euthanasia. So I think there would be plenty of confusion there. But no doubt there's deliberate killing of infants going on too.
Yeah, but
Both.
yeah, I wonder from the outside, do you think that it's possible to distinguish a case of deliberate killing as opposed to healing kind of treatment in the actions? Like, do you think it's possible that there could be two cases which have essentially the same facts and the same doctor's actions, but they have differences in the morality of those cases due to, let's say, the deliberateness of those actions or intentions?
Yes, of course. If I walk into a room, into the clinic, and see the doctor turning off the life support from the little infant, I can't tell what's going on simply by looking. It could be, and all things considered, reasonable withdrawal of treatment that's become overly burdensome for the infant. It could be deliberate killing. I can't tell just by looking.
Right. So in that case, I wonder how the way we can tell is by maybe interviewing or talking to that doctor and understanding the case from their perspective and maybe the parents and other things. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Just as well, the phenomenon that I'm more involved with are the cases where there's a disagreement between doctors and parents, where the doctors have come to the view that what they should do as doctors is to back off and allow the infant to die, and parents are of a different view. Now, that's also very difficult.
Yeah. None of these situations are easy, are they? Unfortunately. So I sent you some information about the Groningen Protocol.
Yes.
What do you think about that protocol? Obviously, that one is basically saying, it's okay to deliberately kill.
That's right.
What do you think about that?
Well, look, I think the criteria are such as the whole protocol should be rejected. Well, one consideration is that the infant must have hopeless and unbearable suffering. Well, how can that judgment be made if we can't ask the infant? Another criterion is that both parents must give informed consent. But that's a misunderstanding of informed consent. So let's say I have something wrong with myself and I go to the doctor and the doctor says, Bernadette, here's what I suggest that you do. He explains the pros and cons, and I either say, yes, I consent to undergoing that treatment, or I refuse it. So if he's properly informed me, that's informed consent or informed refusal. Now, we have a mirror of that in advanced care planning for adults, where if I anticipate, as I should, that as I die, I won't be able to have a conversation with the doctor. And so I need to help to nominate someone else for the doctor to talk to. And then I need to help that person to anticipate what will happen there and make clear what I would and wouldn't want. So that person can give a substituted judgment, which is a form of informed consent because they're reflecting what they know I would have wanted. But there's no such thing. This is a mirage in the case of infants. This isn't informed consent. This is just the parents giving their permission for the baby's life to be deliberately terminated. And as I have said to you, Tom, on my Hippocratic Judeo-Christian view, doctors shouldn't kill their patients. So I do not think well of the Groningen Protocol. Don't even know if I can pronounce it.
That's okay. I can't pronounce it either. Yeah, but yeah, that's completely understandable that you would have that position. I just realized actually, maybe it wasn't what you just said, but something you said earlier about dying with dignity or letting people die with dignity in a Hippocratic Judeo-Christian healing kind of framework. How does that map with suffering? So, for example, I think you've mentioned quite a few times that a doctor should basically seek to relieve suffering, and let's say it's the case of an infant. But is a lack of dignity in dying, so an indignant death, is that a form of suffering, or how does that relate to suffering, or is it possible to have basically an indignant death without actual suffering, do you think?
The concept of dying, the idea of dying with dignity has about 100 different meanings.
Right.
And you can tell that because both the advocates of euthanasia and the opponents of euthanasia all use this concept in defense of their own views. So that shows you there are at least two different meanings of dignity at play here.
True.
When I say that the role of the doctor who's committed to this Hippocratic goal of medicine to heal the person, and that and as the person dies, healing may well be assisting the person to die in comfort and with dignity. In comfort is clearly understood. With dignity is to die as a human being and not say, you know how with animals we put them down. Well, that's not a way of thinking about the last part of a human being's life, just putting them down. Or another way of thinking about human beings that doesn't respect their innate dignity is, sometimes people think of their enemies as just vermin.
Right.
They want to get rid of. Well, again, that fails to respect the equality in worth and dignity of even really wicked people.
Right.
So when I talk about assisting a person to die in comfort and with dignity, that's what I mean. But again, this is tricky ground, Tom, because the expression has different meanings.
Yeah. I think you're totally right in recognizing that probably it's used in all sorts of ways. But yeah, thanks for explaining a little bit about your meaning of dignity. Yeah, that's really good. So, all right. So we've talked about Groningen Protocol. We've talked about arguments for and against, I guess, euthanasia in adults and infants. What I wanted to also mention, because I will discuss this paper in the video, is this paper by Minerva and Giubilini, which is an extremely, I think, well, it's a very controversial article, needless to say, and I think you've read that or you know about that. What's your opinion on that article?
Well, I don't think it said anything very new.
Okay.
But let me comment on two claims.
Sure.
One is that fetuses and newborns are morally equivalent. In this sense, neither of them are persons. and so they cannot be wronged by being killed. That's one complex claim. And then that's what they're not. They're not persons, so they can't be wronged by being deliberately killed. And then another central claim is what they are is potential persons, but the interests of actual persons override the interests of potential persons. So if I can comment just on those two. So that this claim that fetuses and newborns are not persons, the authors, Minerva and Giubilini, are relying on the idea that person means an individual with such a developed cognitive ability that he or she can is aware of themselves, wants to go on, has things they want to do, projects they want to fulfill, and that if they were deliberately killed, that would frustrate the things that they want to do. Now, that's what they mean by person. They didn't invent it. It's an old definition of a person. And it's a very odd definition because, as you would know, it means only some human beings are persons and not all human beings are persons, and some animals are. And attached to that idea is that it's only beings of this kind who want to go on living who have a right that could be violated, a right to life that could be violated. And neither fetuses nor newborns are persons, so neither of them have a right to life. And so they cannot be wronged by being deliberately killed. Well, it relies on a very controversial conception of what it is to be a person. It implies that you need this very highly developed set of cognitive abilities to qualify as a person. Well, that's highly controversial. It attaches no moral weight at all simply to the fetuses and newborns being human. And it's just wrong to claim that there's nothing about human beings which grounds our partiality towards them. The humankind has a quite distinct place in the universe of morality as we encounter. There are all kinds of things about human beings that form the basis of our moral judgments about them. And all of that is just ruled out. And
sorry, Bernadette, could I just interrupt? I didn't understand one word that you said. Was it passibility or?
Partiality.
Oh, partiality, sorry.
Yeah, partiality.
Sorry.
I might have pronounced it correctly. So this argument relies on a highly controversial, rather odd, abstract notion of what is a person. It attaches no moral weight to fetuses and newborns being humans, and there are all kinds of things about them that justify our partiality towards other human beings, even ones who have human capacities in only a very minor embryonic form, and even those who have human capacities in very damaged and debilitated forms. And the argument has very odd results. It would imply, Tony Cody has pointed out that it would imply there's nothing to choose. He imagined a situation where there's an adult and a poisonous snake that's about to attack the adult. And the human adult has an interest in survival, so counts as a person. The poisonous snake has an interest in survival, we can assume, so counts as a person. So it's kind of arbitrary which of those you choose. And indeed, if there were a whole bunch of poisonous snakes, well, the collectivity of their interests in continued survival might outweigh the human being's interest in survival. Well, it's just kind of muddled and silly way, I think, of thinking. So that's one thing, I think, and I don't think that their idea that fetuses and newborns are potential persons is much better. The notion of potential is very tricky, and it relies on the idea that all we care about are the current characteristics and abilities in people. And clearly, we care about their developing capacities, and we still care about human beings when they've lost those capacities. I think it's a remote from reality. So I didn't think there was anything very new in that article. And I think, in a way, both of the authors pointed that out later on. They said what the philosopher Michael Tooley said about fetuses applies to newborn infants. But if you read the philosopher Michael Tooley, he said that too. He too made that point, that birth marks nothing morally distinctive on his view and their view.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So in general, then, yeah. Sorry, I'm just collecting my thoughts for a moment. Yeah. So maybe from the Judeo-Christian perspective of healing, when yeah, I think it's true from that perspective. Definitely, you would care about potential persons or just, life.
Look,
Is that right?
So the notion of a potential person, I think, doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So in other words, though, maybe
But
how would you?
well,
Sorry.
you see that. No, I'm sorry for interrupting you. They say potential person because of their notion of a person.
Right.
A person is a being with such a developed form of cognitive structure that that being has an interest in continuing to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And a fetus and a newborn infant are only on the path to that. That's why they call them potential persons.
Yeah.
Now, I think they're just confused about potentiality.
Yeah. So I think if I'm guessing correctly from the Judeo-Christian perspective of healing, a doctor would be interested and ought to be interested in the health of a fetus and the health of a newborn, not because they're a potential person, but just because they're a human being.
Human individuals.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
The expression human being is itself a kind of controversial one in this discussion, but they're human individuals.
Yeah. I suppose that's true, isn't it? That, like, whether or not they end up becoming in this view a person, or whether or not they have capacities or not, they do have some individuality to them. We can point to their biomass and say that is a individual.
Well, I think it's not just a biological claim that's being made. We're making a claim about the humankind, and human individuals from early on have the innate potential to realize all kinds of capacities, all kinds of abilities, including the ability to choose what they think is right and avoid what they think is wrong, to shape the kind of individual that they become, to shape their character and all of that. Now, that's going much beyond just the biology of the individual. And we value such members of this kind long before they've actualized all of that, and long after lots of them have lost it.
Yeah, yeah, that's true, isn't it? I mean, we also think about, the future generations just as this undefined group of people, potential people, I guess, right? Yeah. So, yeah, I appreciate you sharing your view on that paper. It was definitely controversial, but as you say, maybe there weren't actually as many new points as they gained controversy for. Just lastly, I wanted to ask about existential suffering. This is a term that sometimes people
Yes.
use as a justification for euthanasia. We talked a
Yes.
little bit about psychological suffering, but I wonder, whether or not this is different and how so, and what do you think about that justification?
Well, I think broadly speaking, generalizing, there are two kinds of suffering. There's all the ways in which we can physically suffer, and then there are all the ways in which we can psychologically suffer, and that's what people call existential suffering. And they include, well, I think a very common one is the fear of being a burden on others. Alienation from one's family and friends, indeed from one's society. Despair, looking back on one's life. Guilt, looking back on one's life. Self-loathing. Loneliness. The alienation that someone can feel being kind of confined in a hospital bed and having all these forms of treatment imposed on them. So I think there are lots of forms of psychological or existential suffering. And, well, the medical profession works with others whose professional commitment is to try to relieve those forms of suffering. And I don't want to underplay the significance of those forms of suffering, because I don't think they're foreign to anyone, any of us. I think we know what those suffering are firsthand, even if we've never had physical pain. These other forms of suffering are part of the human condition. And I think the great challenge for good doctors and the team in which they work is to do what they can to respond to those forms of suffering. But as I say, I don't think it's medicine's role to relieve us of the human condition, and these are part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So on that basis, it would be the medical team's role to alleviate the suffering, whether it's existential or physical, as much as possible. But
well, look, the medical team may not be able to.
Right.
So if what I'm suffering from is self-loathing or guilt or the fear of being a burden on others, that may not be something the medical team can relieve.
Maybe a chaplain or a psychologist. Yeah.
Well, look, of course, the thing to do is to try and open it up. And, that's what good doctors are able to do.
Right.
We're able to elicit what's troubling the person. And that's at least a setting for some kind of response. But I don't mean to imply that these things can be easily just wished away, because I don't think they can. And in the end, the recognition of our finitude is mostly a form of suffering in itself.
Right. Yeah. And I suppose that one, maybe that's a type of suffering that just shouldn't or can't be relieved in some way, do you think? Or
Well, No, I think it's there to be addressed and responded to.
Okay.
Yes, I sure
Right.
do.
Okay.
But
Sorry.
not by morphine,
No, I see.
sedation, not by
Right.
eliminating the person.
Yeah. 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 Very good. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate all of your responses to my questions, and I know I pestered you a lot for this interview, and I really appreciate your time.
Good job.
Yeah, is there any other points that you would just like to raise or mention that maybe we didn't touch on, or?
Well, I think the thing that we didn't explain was why deliberately setting out to terminate a person's life violates their equality. That I think we didn't explain, and I was struck by what the English House of Lords said. It's got to be 25 years ago now, when it said, look, let me see if I can just find it. So I wrote it down. It said, so this is 1994, this is back in the Middle Ages.
Okay.
A select committee of the English House of Lords unanimously rejected the legalization of euthanasia, and it put its rejection this way: society's prohibition of intentional killing is the cornerstone of law and social relationships. It protects each of us impartially, embodying the belief that we are all equal. We don't wish that protection to be diminished, and we therefore recommend there should be no change in the law to permit euthanasia. So it raises the question, equal in what respect? And what I think they mean is in the respect of our humanity, our capacity to live the life, not of a carrot, not of a cat, but of a human being. Reason and will are not simply add-ons to mere animal capacities. They qualify and they transform those capacities, making human experience what it is. So it's a capacity for human awareness, feelings, imagination, memory, responsiveness, sexuality, wondering, relating, imagining, communicating, deliberating, choosing, acting. It's all of that. We are equal with respect to all of that, our common humanity.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I mean, that's a really good quote. Yeah. And I think, yeah, that's something that, yeah, obviously you don't need, there's no religious element to that, is there? It can be reasoned that we all have some common humanity that ought to be kept, and
that's right.
yeah,
It ought not be violated.
Ought not be violated. Yeah. 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 Well,
Even. Yeah. Rightio, Tom.
yeah.
Serial pest.
Yeah. Look, but before we go, I just wanted to say, yeah, thank you again, and also that, we discussed some pretty heavy topics, and viewers might be, there might be some anxiety or bad feelings. So just to end on a more happier note, I wondered if you might share maybe what team you barrack for in the footy, in the AFL, Australian Football League, or some hobby that you have, something like that.
Well, I'm glad you asked me, because all the things we've been talking about, I certainly care about. But the allegiance to the Carlton Footy Club goes very deep.
Oh, okay.
Very, very
Right.
deep. And I have the misfortune to be married to an Essendon supporter.
Oh.
Now, that's too general. He's a wonderful man, and I love him very dearly. but he barracks for Essendon.
Mm.
So what that means is that at least twice a year, we are very civil with each other. No more. And when I discover that he is barracking for Carlton, whom he cannot bear, but he's barracking for Carlton for strategic reasons, he thinks it will serve his purposes as an Essendon supporter, that's really hard to bear.
Well, it sounds like you've had a lot of situations. So twice a year, right? They play
Twice
against.
a year.
Yeah. Okay. So there
Right.
would have been a lot of interesting situations around those matches, I guess.
Yeah.
Have they ever been in a final together, those two teams, or something?
Well, there was a famous preliminary final that 1998 or 1999 that Essendon was predicted to win hands down.
Right.
And they lost by a point. And I had assumed that Essendon would win. So I went out of the house that afternoon.
Right.
And my daughter had this very indulgent mother who went window shopping with her for hours and hours because I didn't want to be home. And then we won by a point.
Oh, wow.
So I didn't go upstairs for the first hour for two reasons. One, because I wanted to talk to my family in Melbourne who all share my allegiance, who wanted to enjoy the moment. And secondly, because I wanted to give him a little bit of time on his own.
Well, that was quite strategic of you, I guess.
It was intended to be, didn't kind of work out.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks.
What about you? Who do you barrack on?
Well, I don't know if it's some sort of patriarchy thing, but I just took on the team of my father, which is Melbourne Demons, so that made me a very bad Catholic boy.
Oh,
well, I mean, their nickname is the Demons, isn't it? So I don't know if you can rightly, but I remember in growing up, wondering, is that right?
Did you? Well, when I was growing up, Melbourne were at the top of the ladder, and they won every final and all of that.
Yeah.
But we thought they were rather posh.
Okay.
You see, my family, my father came from Brunswick,
right?
And like you, I just took on the allegiances of the family.
Yeah. But I haven't been able to see any matches of late, of course, because of coronavirus, and I'm living in Japan. So, but
you've been in Japan.
Yeah, I live in Japan. I've been here for a few years.
Are you in Japan now?
Yeah, right now.
Wow. I thought your cupboard looked as though it was in Melbourne.
Yeah, I mean, it could very well be. Yeah, but it's not. So, yeah, but.
All right, Tom. So have we done the chit chat?
Yeah, so I'll stop the recording now.
Okay.